Hi, my name is Kristen Fay, and I'm an assistant curator at the Petersen Automotive Museum. Now, today I'm going to take you on a tour of a really special vehicle in our collection. This car really is a profound example of 1930s Art Deco streamline style, and in my opinion, really is simply one of the most beautiful cars in our collection. So I think it really captures the essence of really what it meant to live in the streamlined, mechanized age. And it's just really just a perfect example of that 1930s coachwork. So let me introduce you to this car here, the 1937 Talbot-Lago 150 CS. Now, the Talbot-Lago was made during a really particularly transformative time in the interwar period. And when I talk about transformative, I mean in terms of ideology. So we have this car being made following what is really known as the Second Industrial Revolution, which is the time from around the 1870s to World War I. During this time, if you followed my walkthrough of the Tatra T87, you'll remember that there was really a dramatic change in transport and communications technologies during this time. Essentially, this was sort of the phase in the Western economy when you're moving from that first part of the Industrial Revolution, which is like coal mining and cotton mills, to what we would more consider a modern age. You had the development of plastics, transatlantic flight, the airplane, radio broadcast, and the popularization of motion pictures. Now, on the vehicle side, you also had, for the first time, a scientific study of streamlining. Now, aerodynamicist Paul Gere actually began writing about streamlining in 1921. And you'll see in vehicles like the Tatra and Chrysler Airflow would actually really directly translate his principles into design, just like copy and paste. But there really was kind of another component of technology that was examined in the 1930s. It was essentially, following World War I, people were thinking about, how did technology fit into society? Like, what was it like to live in the mechanized world? What does this mean? And you have the emergence of movements like the Streamline Moderne movement in Art Deco, which really focused on speed and efficiency being a hallmark of life. Now, this car, the 150 CS, was built by the Talbot-Lago company, which actually started in 1902 as a French-British brand. Now, the car company kind of has a convoluted history. Throughout its time between the 1900s and the 1930s, it would be bought and sold. It would be merged with Sunbeam and Duroc and even Hillman at one point. But by the mid-1930s, the company had been purchased by a major Anthony Lago, who really helped to consolidate and reimagine the brand. And the 150 CS is one of the models that he would come up with, which really helped cement the brand's reputation as this sort of like artistic maker. So in a similar way, automotive coach builders of the 1930s really drew on the car's capacity for emotional expression. Now, this style, which is typically called Art Deco or streamline, was really characterized by these dramatic billowing shapes and little artistic details. These cars sort of acted like sculptures that really conveyed the emotional experience of high-speed travel. I like to think of these cars and the chassis they were built on essentially like functional canvases. And this car here is really one of the most influential, really just the most iconic example of this. So this style of bodywork on this car is actually known as a drop of water or teardrop shape. Essentially, these cars are known as the teardrop Talbots. Now, Joseph Figoni thought that the water droplet was essentially one of the most perfect forms in nature. I mean, incidentally, it was also proven to be one of the most scientifically aerodynamic form. So you have this design that blends this sort of impressionistic idea of nature with a really technical, streamlined approach. Now, Figoni and Falaschi produced about 14 cars with this style of bodywork for Talbot-Lago in two series from 1937 to 1948. Now, the first few cars in this series were called Jeancart teardrops. They were named after the individual who bought the first one and were made with a notchback design. So the next batch of cars, the second batch, were known as the New York teardrops. And you can tell that this car actually is one of the New York versions because it has an uninterrupted fastback design. And these were named because the model was introduced at the 1937 New York Auto Show. One of the most notable things about this car, and kind of what drives a lot of people to its beauty, is that it's very curvilinear. Essentially, there's not a single straight line on this car. I kind of like to think of it, it's almost difficult to believe that it's sheets of metal that were formed over these sort of wooden lathes, because it's such a curvilinear organic form. And every curve on this car is actually a compound curve, which means that it's a curve that's built of two radii, circles with two radii instead of being symmetrical, which really gives it a sort of organic form that still has this artistic balance. Now, an interesting thing about this car, and that's kind of essential to its meaning, is that it was actually built on a racing chassis. So the 150C was actually driven by Louis Chiron, and if you know the Bugatti Chiron, that's the driver it's named after, in the 1937 Grand Prix, and he actually won it. So this chassis was actually, it had a racing history, and this bodywork was sort of an expression of that racing history in visual form. So if you move around to the front of the car, I mean, the racing car was actually an open wheel car, so it didn't have these fender coverings. You'll see that it sort of belies that sort of form. You have like your centerpiece and what would be covering the wheels here, and these channels they sort of artistically interpret what it was like to have that open wheel form in something that's closed wheel. The funny thing is about these cars is that in later years, some of them would actually be raced. They would actually race this teardrop style of coachwork, and they would end up cutting off these fenders to kind of make it more like the original car. But in this form, this car it just interprets that race car in a form that was sinuous and streamlined, in a more artistic form. You can see that it's almost like the jet wings of the 1950s, where you have this sort of very forward motion. And this really helps to give this car the impression of movement even when it's standing still, which is essentially the intention here. It really just has this dramatic presence, and I've been trying to think of, kind of what makes that part of the design. I know we've talked about some of the forward-leaning curves and, our kind of compound curves, but there is another element to this. It's like a sort of precision. One of these hallmarks is you can see this sort of knife edge that runs along the tops of these fenders. This line really helps to kind of connect the car. If you move to the back, you'll actually see that this moves in a really, pretty much a straight line continuing from the front to the rear fenders, which is pretty incredible considering that these are all hand-built. So moving around to the back of the car, you'll see this sort of hint at a sort of rear stabilizing fin. Now, we had cars like the Tatra, who we discussed, really incorporated actual scientific streamlining principles, where the fin actually had a function. This is more like a little bit of an artistic interpretation of it. It's just sort of suggested and highlighted about the chrome. Essentially, this was what Figoni and Falaschi interpreted as, this is a race car, this is a streamlined car, this is the visual impression of it, rather than something that was actually scientifically tested. So I know we've talked a lot about the artistic interpretation of this car, but it actually did include some elements of actual streamlining. So I'm going to start with the door handles here. Door handles are one of my favorite parts of cars. It's just the part that you as a user would interface first. And you can see that these door handles are actually flush with the bodywork here. To open the door, you'd press it in, and then you'd rotate it, and then you'd open the door. Now, this is actually a practice that was borrowed from streamlined racing cars. The door handle is actually one of the most inefficient, aerodynamically inefficient parts of the car. It's on the side. It creates a lot of turbulence, and this would have eliminated that turbulence. Incidentally, giving the car sort of a more scientifically streamlined feel, but it also meant that these sort of elegant lines where you kind of imagine the air channeling along this course here was uninterrupted by these side slab panels of the car. So one of the cool little details about this car that really brings it into that sort of, actually that ornamental Art Deco style, is this little focus here on these turn signals. Like the Tatra, this actually had these little tournicators that there's a little knob in there, you turn and they kind of fly out like little wings, which would indicate which direction the car was turning. But you'll notice this little reflector light on the top here. The profile's really cool because it's kind of like what you would call that step pyramid shape. And this was a really prominent form in Art Deco architecture. This door is actually pretty cool here because you can see it really has a shape that follows the shape of the car. You have this very organic, I mean, you can see it's almost like a teardrop shape kind of originating right here. And it almost gives it almost like an Art Nouveau kind of organic feel. Now the coolest thing about these doors is they'll actually open outwards. So here, if we can just, I need two hands, so push open, turn the doorknob. And here we are. This door has a little bit of a weight to it, so I can just kind of hold it open for you. And you'll see the inside of this car, it's almost like a little bit like a yacht. You have this beautiful wood paneling here and sort of a slight Art Deco detail. But one of the things you'll notice about the interior is even though the outside of the car is quite dramatic, it has this sort of almost very purposeful and Spartan. And the dials themselves are pretty simple and kind of easy to read. You have your speedometer here, you have oil temperature, you have oil pressure, your tachometer over here. These kind of horn-like knobs actually would be to open the windscreen. They didn't have air conditioning, so that would be how you would get ventilation into the car. Essentially, if you wanted it cooler, you would just drive faster. Now, one of the interesting things about this car, actually, you can see, and this is one of its main technological innovations, is this little sort of fan-shaped device next to the steering wheel. It has numbers on it. This actually was the car's Wilson selector gearbox. When you're driving, or it's really developed for racing, so when you're racing, you'd anticipate that let's say you wanted to go into a curve and downshift. You would move the selector knob to the gear, let's just say first gear, and then as you approach the corner, you would depress the clutch or selector pedal. And when it was kind of at the appropriate height, the car would automatically shift into the gear you selected mechanically. And you'll see this car, it's really built. I mean, it's very solid and tight, and you'll see when you close it, it has a very definitive sound. So you'll see actually that this car is right-hand drive, and there's sort of a number of theories about it. One of these was that it was actually more fashionable and really signaled that you drove a luxury car in France if it was right-hand drive. So if it wasn't obvious from the exterior of the car that it was a luxury car, you could look in at the driver and see they were on the right-hand side. And now remember that this car actually was also based on a race car. So the other kind of reasoning behind why this might be on the right side is that the racing tracks would go clockwise, and the driver would want to sit on the inside of the track to kind of have a more optimal driving position. So the steering wheel and driving accoutrements were on the right side. But this car didn't just convey the experience of speed. Remember that it was actually based on the racing engine and chassis that Louis Chiron would drive to win the 1937 French Grand Prix. Now this engine is a 4.0-liter straight-six engine that actually had hemispherical heads, which were quite advanced in the 1930s. This gave it about 140 horsepower, but it could be tuned to produce up to 180 horsepower. So I do want to mention something about these, about the headlights and the front grille here. So you'll see that these headlights are actually faired into the front bumpers of the vehicle. Now this was basically to give it a more streamlined appearance and made sure that the lines were not interrupted by the car. But you also, if you look on the grills here, you have this continuation of those sort of striated lines that sort of go throughout the body of the car, really giving it an expression of speed. So with a lot of cars in our collection, we don't exactly know where they came from, but with this one, we actually do. This is chassis 90106 of this teardrop shape. So this car was actually originally owned by the chairman of Bentley Motors. Until the 1960s, it was in the UK and eventually was purchased by Peter Mullin. Now, the original color of this car actually wasn't this eggplant, it was kind of blue. This color here was actually a personal choice of Mr. Mullin. He would always sit next to this car with a glass of wine, and perhaps the color of the wine influenced his choice. But This sort of like eggplant color was also a prominent color that was used on other Figoni flashy vehicles of the period. And you'll notice if you get really close to it, it's not just purple, it has like kind of a gold, and that allows it to really pick up these beautiful curves and really draw out the details of the car. So you here have, basically, it acted as a functional canvas that provided its builders, drivers, and owners with a means of self-expression that really reflected the rapidly changing world around them. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining me, Kristen Fay, on the tour of the museum's Talbot-Lago 150 CS. Now, if you're looking for more automotive content, as always, check out the Petersen's YouTube channel or subscribe to our socials. See you next time.